Okay, so I might just try and get this cube lined up just a little bit better. So I'll just select that face, tap up to select the cube group, and I'll just grab this rotate Y, I'll just click on it in the channel box, and I'll middle mouse drag in the viewport just to see if we can get a bit more parallel. And it looks like it's closest when we get to about 0.25. So I'm just going to enter that in this box here. Now I'll also get the translate X, click on that, and I'm just going to move this over just a little bit. Now it's not going to be perfect, because if we go back to here, we can see that it is a little bit far left, and here it's a little bit far right. So our coordinate system is sort of a little bit off, but for the purposes of this demonstration, and for the purposes of what we have in mind, this is going to be fine. So we now have all of this geometry in our scene that represents our background architecture that we have in our footage. And the reason that we have this is not so that we can render this out. Because we have this background footage, we don't want to render objects over it. But what we can do is we can apply a special material to these objects now, called the Use Background material. And what that will do is it will show the background footage, but it will superimpose on top of that things like shadowing and reflections. So we'll be able to fake the casting of shadows on our background footage. Now, the other reason that we have this geometry in our scene is so that we can we have a visual representation in 3D space of the objects that we have in our footage. And if we come up to our panels and go to perspective, and I'll just zoom out just a little bit, we can see that we now have the wall and floor, our post here, and these columns here, which we can now tell where to place objects in our scene to make it look like they are actually placed in this background footage. So if we wanted a character to, say, and looking at this footage here, if we wanted a character to walk down between this post and these columns towards camera, we can actually animate a character walking down here, and when we shoot through the RZ camera, it's going to we can render that out and superimpose it on the background footage. Now, for our lesson, for our demonstration, I'm not going to animate any characters. What I want is something fairly simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to animate a ball bouncing from off-screen into our scene here, bouncing off this wall, off this floor, maybe onto this wall or one of these posts, and bouncing around in this general area here. Now, if I wanted to do this a simple way, or, well, the way that probably first springs to mind, is that I'll create a NURBS sphere, and I'll just move it into place. Hang on. Just move it into place from off screen, and I will scale it up, and then I'll keyframe it here, and I'll keyframe it when it hits the ground, and keyframe it bouncing off the ground and hitting the wall, then keyframe it hitting the ground again, and then keyframe it maybe bouncing one more time or rolling along the ground, and do all of these things that are, well, they can be a little bit difficult to get to appear realistic. It takes a lot of tweaking. We'll have to mess around with the curves and all that sort of stuff. And I'm generally a lazy person. That's just who I am. And I'm also pretty sure that if I came in here and tried to manually keyframe the path of a bouncing ball, I'm not going to get that realistic a representation of how it's supposed to look. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sit back and let Maya do all of the hard work for me. And the way that I'll do that is with dynamics. So what we need in order to make a dynamic simulation of a ball bouncing in our scene is we need for the ball to be an active rigid body, and we can come up here and you can see that here's our dynamics menu, and this is our soft rigid bodies tab in that menu. We need the ball to be an active rigid body. We need everything in our scene that is going to interact with this ball, so any walls that it's going to bounce off, we need these to be passive rigid bodies, and so we have these passive rigid bodies that we're going to set up here. Now, so the first thing that I'll do is I'll convert these objects to passive rigid bodies, and I'll convert this to an active rigid body later on. Just selecting this ground plane, coming over to here, we can see that we have a lot of values in our translate, rotate and scale attributes. For dynamics to work properly, it's best if all of this is zeroed out in its initial position. So what I can do is come up to modify and just freeze transformations, and you can see that that has zeroed out our translate and rotate and put a 1 in all of our scale attributes. And so this is now at its default starting position, and so Dynamics will be able to use this object. Now, rather than go through all of the objects in this scene and try to set them all up with the freeze transformations up in this menu, on my custom shelf I have brought down this freeze transformations button from modify here. And if you don't know how to do that, it is in a previous video on creating props for UDK, but I can just show you now. It's a fairly simple thing. Say this button here, which is to create passive rigid bodies. I'll just delete this from this shelf, and I'll do that by middle clicking and dragging that button over to the trash can. So that's how you get rid of a button. And then I'll just hold down Control and Shift, and I can come up to the Soft Rigid Bodies tab here, come down to Create Passive Rigid Body, and with that Control and Shift held, just click on this button here. And you can see that it is now in the shelf here. And that's just how I've brought all of these buttons onto my shelf. What I might do is just see if doing a big sort of group selection, and I can see that I've got my locators selected as well, so I don't want that. So I'll just uncheck this question mark here in the selection filter, and that means that now we won't select things like our locators. So I'll just select everything in the scene that I want the transformations to be frozen. I'll just click on the Freeze Transformations button, and now, yep, everything has been frozen. All the transformations have been frozen, so it's all been reset. Now the cubes, the individual planes are all automatically at their default zeroed out settings anyway, but the actual cube group is in hasn't had its transformations frozen, and so I might just go through and just freeze transformations on these cubes by selecting one of the elements, tapping up so I select the group, and hitting freeze transformations. So now everything is has its transformations frozen, and I'll just do this for this ball as well. Now these objects that aren't going to be moving, I need to convert these into passive rigid bodies, and this is fairly simple. I just select the object, and this button, which is the same as the button here, I'll just click on that. Now you can see that our translates and rotates have been yellowed out. This is just an indicator that they are getting information or getting inputs on these attributes, and in this case it's from the dynamic simulation. And so I'm just going to select everything that I want the ball to be able to interact with and bounce off. Now the cubes that we have in our scene, we don't need to select every face of the cubes. For example, the faces that are against the wall or up on top or against the ground, we don't need those. And this particular cube, I don't want the cube top here to be a passive rigid body, because you can see in the footage that this area is actually open top. So if we do have any balls jumping over this this sort of fence, they will just fall into this area here. And so I'll just go through and I might switch to a shaded mode. That's tapping 5, and I'll just come in here and I will select these elements individually, and I will convert these to passive rigid bodies, and I'll just get the other sides of these things. And this one. And I'll also select the inside walls of this cube, or the walls that are going to be facing in on this pathway here. Okay, so there are our passive rigid bodies. Now for our active rigid body, I might just move this up and I'll freeze transformations again. Now for this, we could come up to active rigid body, and then we'd create a gravity field, and then we'd link the active rigid body to the gravity field in a relationship editor, in the dynamic relationships window. But a faster way to do it is just select any object that you want to create, or you want to convert into an active rigid body, and then select the field that you want to affect it. So I'm just going to hit it with some gravity. Now the gravity is at our origin point, because the default for gravity is that distance from this is not going to be an issue. You can change that, but by default it's not set to that from the beginning. Because the distance isn't a problem, I can more or less place this anywhere in the scene. So I'm just going to place it over here, so if I need to I can just select it more easily. Now this should now be, and you can see here we've got our translates and rotates yellowed out. This is now an active rigid body. And so if we rewind to the beginning of our scene and press play, this should fall as if affected by gravity. So let's just have a look at that. Doesn't look like much is happening, but if we wait for a while we can see that yes, the ball is falling very slowly, like it's falling in slow motion. But that isn't very realistic gravity. I mean, our background here is playing back at more or less real time, so why is the ball not moving so quickly? And the reason for this is that in this scene we are using centimeters as our default unit. All of the dynamics are set up to use meters as the default unit of measurement, and so in order to get this to play back at the right speed, or for gravity to affect it at the right speed, we need to come to our gravity and come down to the magnitude, and the magnitude is currently set to 9.8, and that's 9.8 meters. And so 9.8 meters in centimeters is 980. And once we do that, now if we rewind and play, you can see that the ball is falling at the appropriate speed. And that just means that it is falling at 9.8 meters a second. So in the next lesson, I'm just going to get this ball to come into our scene and to bounce around, and we'll see you for that lesson.